Okay, this video will focus on the discussion of globalization, okay, which will be very important in understanding the rest of the modules in our later discussions. Okay, first things first, what is globalization? It talks about interconnectedness of nations. Not only nations, but processes, no, including interconnectedness in education, interconnectedness in the economy, in cultural understanding, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if we talk about interconnectedness, it simply means that nations are linked together like a global village. There's a mutual interdependence, coexistence, and mutual understanding of nations around the globe. So it implies that there is a global village created by these countries that are closely linked to each other. Okay, they can also be dependent with each other in terms of supplying resources or in terms of extending help to other nations. Okay, or it can also mean integration. One nation is integrated with another country, meaning to say it is part of the larger system of nations. Okay, so these are some of the ideas of interconnectedness of nations. In other words, there is no such thing as independence or self-sufficiency in interconnectedness. What does it mean? Self-sufficiency. Okay, if you look back at history, in our history, there was a period of time when nations were actually uh, independent. They didn't need, okay, for example, they didn't need to trade their goods and services to other countries because they thought they were self-sufficient. Okay, there were periods in history where these patterns of production were true, no? They were called the closed economies. Yung hindi sila nagbubukas sa ibang nations. Okay? Ay, itong sinatawag na autarky. Autarky situation is when a country does not open itself to another country in terms of trading goods and services. It can survive on its own, right? But through time, through the internationalization process, goods and services already moved from different countries, okay, in order to exchange for other goods and services. Dito nagsimula ang ating international trade. Nevertheless, okay, that is the basic understanding of globalization. Okay, now moving on, we have the concept of the metaphors. Okay, part of the module talks about the metaphors. So basically, what is a metaphor? Okay, metaphor is a symbolism. Okay, it's a symbolism attached to a particular thing or a person or anything that has a meaning. Okay, so for example, when you are going to talk about a light, like a light, you know, the candle light, what does it symbolize? It symbolizes truth or purity, right? So this is an example of a metaphor. What is the allegorical symbolic meaning underneath an object or a place for that matter? All right? So in globalization, we have three big metaphors as discussed in your module. The first metaphor is solid. So ano ba ang characteristics ng solid? So solid is hard, okay? So in terms of globalization, nations are actually understood in terms of the resources. Resources are hard evidences of globalization. Some countries have resources, some have mountains, bridges, okay, all these things that qualify a country with the endowment of these resources. So solid sila. Now, solid can also be in the form of that, as what the module says, it can also mean an imaginary barrier. Okay, so for example, if the Philippines is fighting for ownership of the West Philippine Sea, now there's a dispute. There's always been a dispute between the Philippines and China, and Philippines is asserting its presence, its ownership over the Philippine Western Philippine Sea, West Philippine Sea rather. That is also part of the solid flow. Okay, the solidity of the globalization process. Okay, now when these solid barriers, okay, are melted down, meaning to say, natutunaw sila. Okay, when for example, during these negotiations between Philippines and China over the West Philippine Sea, if there is going to be an agreement, a mutual agreement among nations, among the two nations, okay, a form of liquidity happens. So the liquidity now is what? A transformation, okay? Meaning to say there is already a movement, like when you see water is a liquid, there is an understanding, a mutual movement of the minds, no? When there is the meeting of the minds, and if people can already move to China, okay, and then goods and services will now be coming back and forth from the Philippines onto China. This is an example of liquidity in terms of globalization. So really, when globalization takes place, it means there is a mutual understanding among the different processes in economics and politics, in social-cultural activities, etc., etc. This is liquidity. Okay. Now moving on. According to your module, flows, which is the next level of metaphor, are the movement of people, like I said earlier, things, places, and information brought by the growing porosity of global limitations. This simply means that the process of interconnectivity brought about by liquid interactions gives rise to exchange of cultural understandings. So anong ibig sabihin nito? Pag meron na tayong sinasabi na flows, meaning to say, what transpires in the economic transaction of exchange of goods. Okay, when the Philippines will exchange goods between the Philippines and China, okay, as I discussed earlier in liquidity, what happens in flows? There is a corresponding effect on that exchange. Meaning to say, meron ding transformation, let's say in the cultural aspect. Philippines will now be able to learn Chinese culture, know about their ways of life, and even go into the depth of their cultural practices, things like that. In the same way as China, okay, engaging an economic interdependence with the Philippines, will now have a chance to learn about our local culture. So this is a cultural appropriation. This is a cultural assimilation, a mutual understanding of two countries that leads to mutual understanding. Okay, so imagine if two countries will do this and the rest of the world will follow the same pattern of fluidity. When there's continuous flow of understanding, okay, the world is going to be a good place to live in. No? Wala tayong mga conflicts. Even if there are conflicts, they will be resolved because of the metaphors of fluidity that are in place. Okay? All right, so in the module, we have the concept map analysis, which you are going to study on your own. All right, so yung mga interrelationships between the liquid, the solid, and flow, the interrelationships of these variables, how do they affect globalization? Okay, pretty much I already laid out the foundation of your analysis, which you will just enhance in your discussion. The next part of the module is talking about perspectives of globalization. There are three major perspectives discussed. We have hyper-globalists, skeptics, and transformationalists. So ano ang mga hyper-globalists? The hyper-globalists, hyper meaning excited, euphoric, they contend that pre-globalization is called internationalization. In the contemporary setting, nation-states reduce their power as the focus shifts to global processes. So dito pa lang maintindihan na natin na in the hyper-globalist perspective, no, the role of the domestic country like the Philippines as a separate economic unit, okay, does not exist. Okay, it is favoring on the idea of internationalization, meaning to say the hyper-globalists contend that the Philippines is an international country that relates with the rest of the world, rather than specifying or specializing on the domestic economy itself. Okay, once again, hyperglobalists reckon that the Philippines relates to the rest of the world. It is part of the global process, not just as an entirely independent nation that does not take care of the world affairs. No, hindi sila ganon. So ano itong mga examples ng hyperglobalists? Okay, we have multinational corporations. Okay, these are corporations like McDonald's. They are owned, all right, by they're originally owned by Americans, all right, but they have different branches of the restaurant, of the food chain in different countries, including the Philippines. Okay, so with that idea of the McDonald's as a multinational corporation, it creates a hyper-globalist perspective wherein the McDonald's company has to go outside of the United States. They have to sort of invade, no, encroach upon other economies, build their stores, learn about the culture, and that's it. Yung internationalization is so much a focus on, rather than focusing McDonald's within the United States. Okay, that is just one example to illustrate hyperglobalism. Okay, there are so many examples you can think of on that line of analysis. Now we have the skeptics. Ano yung skeptics? Or sino sila? Skeptical. Ano ba yun? It means someone is doubtful. Someone does not believe. Okay? So skeptics, on the other hand, believe that globalization is a novel idea, and at the same time argue that it has existed for many centuries before, where cultural, economic, social, and technological developments have occurred in various stages. Nation states play an important role alongside transnational responsibility. So anong ibig sabihin nito? Sinasabi nito na ang skeptics, na ang globalization rather is something that has happened in the past, no? But if it happened in the past, it doesn't mean that it was right there. It was globalization right there. The skeptics, because they doubt, okay, anything that is new, anything that is flourishing, they contend that before a country enters into a globalization, it becomes part and it focuses on its domestic economy. Ito yung sinasabi dito na nation states. Nation states, okay, were the terms used before, during the medieval periods, when the focus of domestic economies, okay, politics, domestic meaning to say internal policies, were very, very important in shaping the entire society. No? So if the country was, for instance, allowing itself to open up to other nations, it was only doing so to protect the interest of the domestic economy or the domestic politics. In some cases, nation states were trying to protect their own military prowess. No? So they would conduct trades, they would acquire bullions of gold and other metals, so that their military power will be strengthened. Okay, that is an example of what a skeptic would view globalization. Okay, now we move on. We have three theories of globalization. That our last topic before I end this short video. The first theory of globalization is world systems theory. Okay? World. So anong world? Yung mundo, the globe. Okay? The entire world is the world. Then we have the system. Okay, before we talk about the world systems theory, first we understand what a system is, no? We have the universe as a system, you have the digestive system. So ano yung system? Okay, a system is a totality. It's an aggregation of the different components that are interrelated with one another. Meaning to say, the parts of the system, if we look at ourselves, ako, as a human being, I am a system because I'm composed of the different parts of the body. I have the hands, I have the head, that are interrelated, integrated with one another. In other words, the functions of the hand are interrelated with the functions of the head. That will give me the system, which is me, the person. So in other words, the holistic function of the system is defined by the integration of the different elements within the system. So how is that related to the world systems theory? Okay, well, let's continue with the module. The theory posits that the world is a unit. So the unit there is the system that I talked about. It's a unit instead of concentrating on each country. It divides countries into core countries. So first, what is it telling you? It is telling you that the world systems theory considers itself as a one entire unit, okay? A one entire system instead of focusing on individual nations. The world in itself is a system that is interconnected and integrated with one another. In order to function globally, it has to be integrated among the different countries. So it explains that there are core countries, periphery countries, and semi-periphery countries. Ano yung mga core countries? Okay, these core countries are the Western nations. Core, they are the center. They are the centers of production, of knowledge and technology. And these are countries that are economically robust, meaning strong, with heavy industrialization, and information and technology are widely used. So think of the United States, Europe, Japan. All these superpowers are belonging to the core countries. Periphery countries, okay, what do you think? They include countries like the Philippines. We're in the periphery. Pag sinasabi nating periphery, meaning we're on the side. Nasa gilid lang tayo, hindi tayo nasa gitna. So periphery, we are a third world country, we are a developing country. We mainly export raw materials. Ano yung sinasabi ko na raw materials? Let's say in the production of cars, we do not produce the cars in the Philippines, but we provide the raw materials. We can provide labor, our workers, that's part of the resource, or the tire. Okay, and then we export these raw materials to the developed countries, which are the core countries, to process these products, and then they are being sold to different countries, including us. Bumibili din tayo sa mga kotse na yan na actually tayo ang we work for the production process, in the production process rather. So another example would be, let's say we have rice. Okay, we have rice as our exportable commodity. We do produce rice a lot and we export them. But sometimes rice in other countries can be used as a raw material for further production. Meron dyan ginagawa silang paper, expensive paper. There are production processes that are also using rice, for example, or corn, okay, that used in the production of gasoline. Okay, so in that case, the corn, or the corn for that matter, becomes the raw material in the production of gasoline, which in turn is exported to other countries, and we end up buying those, right? And then the semi-periphery countries are those countries that are in the middle ground. Nasa gitna sila ng core and periphery. They are usually diversified and well-developed economy, even if they are not internationally competitive. So there are countries here in the world that are not internationally recognized, but they can stand also on their own. They are diversified, meaning to say they have so many levels of production and so many production choices and levels of economic activities, and they can pretty much rely on their own. They are not poor, and they're not also very rich, okay? But they are not like us. They are above us in some ways, all right? Then moving on, we have the modernization theory. Modernization theory presupposes that countries follow a similar pattern from a traditional to modern society. This implies that traditional countries can develop into modern nations with advancement in technology, increased labor, and capital resource allocation. So what does the theory tell us? Simply it tells us that the start of an economy will always be from the standpoint of agriculture. Even before agriculture, we had hunting and gathering. No, way back in high school or even elementary, you were taught about the kaingin system, the slash and burn culture of the nomadic people in the Philippines. No, and then later on, when they realized that food was already not abundant, they learned that the resources were scarce, or meaning to say they were no longer abundant for us to feed, to feed our hungry mouths. So what did the people do? They had to plant in order to address the scarcity. So through agriculture, it made some sense in trying to preserve resources. And also in this manner of preservation, there was some form of technological innovation. Nomadic people learned how to use different tools of cultivation. Okay, you remember the Stone Age when we had the adze and all the other tools that were used by the cave people back then. And then as time went on, agriculture was what? It gave rise to further production processes. People from the fields, okay, who originally were members of the family, tried to migrate to the cities, no? In order to work in the industries, yung mga factories. Now, these factories were now needing more capital and more laborers in order to proceed with the production processes. And the whole thing gave rise to industrialization, no? With the invention of the wheel, with the invention of the steam engine, and out of that, the rise of new knowledge, science came in, reasoning, and all these things in philosophy were what? They became part of the revolution, of the industrial revolution. And then we have now the information age, where we deal with information not just as a simple thing in our mind. Information is now considered part of the economic production. So we have the information economy. Now, when the Philippines, for instance, will focus on digital economies, digital technologies, they will actually help propel our economy to greater heights. So information is now part of the production process in order to increase productivity of the country, and so on and so forth. So we can see the movement from tradition up to the post-industrial stage, the age of information, the age of digital economy. That is what the modernization theory is all about. It doesn't mean, when you say modernization, doesn't mean that it has to start from modern. No, there is a historical process there from agriculture onto the next stage, and so on and so forth. Okay? And then we have the dependency theory. This is a reaction to modernization theory, which looks into inequalities between countries. Okay, pag sinasabi nating dependency, what comes into our mind is dependent. We are dependent. A is dependent on B. A being the Philippines, B being United States of America. So when we are discussing dependency theory, it simply means that the Philippines is dependent on America for so many things. And this creates inequalities. Ito yung sinasabi dito na inequalities. Bakit? Factor endowments, factors. Ano ba yung mga factors niya? Factors to production. We have labor, we have capital, we have technology. They are inputs to the production process. Pag kulang tayo ng capital, we need we need computers. We have to go to America in order to suffice the need of capital requirements. Thus, we are dependent on the America. Now, in this dependency theory, okay, in this dependent situation, it creates inequality. Why? Simply that even within the country, in the Philippines, where there is already an existing disparity in incomes, it further aggravates inequality because some sectors in the economy will not be able to acquire that capital, that computer, while others who are in upper echelons, who have the means and the income to buy those capital needs, will be able to acquire as easily as possible. Okay? And in the grand narrative of dependency, all right, these third world countries like the Philippines, as main exporters of raw materials only, not finished products, okay, it creates an idea that we are underdeveloped or undeveloped because we are not supplying the final products. We're only feeding, okay, some raw materials for the production of these goods in later parts done in other countries. Okay, and added to that is the fact that people in the Philippines, even with struggles to emancipate from economic starvation, we are still facing those inequities or economic deprivations because of the fact that there is an economic stratification or an economic disparity between countries. Meron tayong background na what you call this, chicken, roosters, no? Kasi gabi na ngayon eh. All right? And then lastly, globalization and religion. Okay? Globalization and religion, religious faith is spread globally through the use of technology. So dito pa lang, malalaman na natin na through globalization, religious faiths can actually be connected. So ang mga Christians in the Philippines can be connected to Christians in the United States through the mediation of technology. For instance, okay? And for globalization as a process, the manner of universal what you call is praying, no? Meron tayong mga pilgrimage to Mecca. Now people go to these places in the holy land of in the Muslim faith, where people pray together. And in our Christian tradition, we have anong mga panata natin, like in the Holy Week. Okay, we go to certain areas, and in the global scenario, we go to Rome, Italy, no? During Holy Week celebrations, things like that. In other words, globalization brings faith closer to the people that practice the faith. Okay, and of course, technology, as I mentioned quite earlier, technology has something to do with the spread of these religious ideologies, because you can easily communicate with other members of the same sect. Not only in terms of the communication within the same sect, but also with other religious faiths. Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus can communicate well outside the what you call this, their religious borders. No? In globalization, the idea of openness and interdependence is very important, such that there is a communication among different religious faiths. Okay? So minsan makikita natin sa ating mga prayers, you know, in certain institutions, we do not really insist our Catholic, I'm a Catholic, but sometimes we do not insist our Catholic faith because it has to be multi-dimensional. I mean, the congregation is from different sects. So we also honor the presence of the Muslims and all the other religious faiths. Okay, that's part of the global understanding. So, as a consequence of globalizing faith, religion has become a non-territorial touchstone of identity, according to Aldama in 2018. Practitioners endorse their faith to a global level, linking Muslims, Christians, and other religious faiths from different parts of the globe as one community. So, it is not a territorial touchstone of identity, meaning to say, like Christianity or Roman Catholicism is not only based in the Philippines. It is spread all throughout the world due to the advantages of technology and all the other global linkages linking different religious faiths. That is the idea of globalization and religion. To create a global community, to create a global villages, to create a global village rather of people worshiping the same faith and a sense of understanding with other faiths in the world. Okay. However, despite attempts at hybridity or homogeneity of religion due to its worldwide connectivity, the case of identity assertion is inevitable as each faith follows some internal religious practices, rituals, and belief systems that can give rise to conflict with other religions. Islam is so much different with Christianity. As such, any form of globalization will only dispel individual faiths rather than collective understanding. So anong sinasabi dito, no? Kahit meron tayong homogeneity and congruence of different religious faiths, there is also the tendency for Christians to assert their identity as Christians because we have our own internal rituals. We worship according to our faith, according to the doctrines of the church, that is quite different from what the Muslims do. So in globalization, the danger of knowing each other's faith and communicating, we might not be able to really assert our identity as Christian faith due to the difference. Due to the the flooding of different faiths. No, okay. So you have to know. In other words, the implication of this part here. The sense of knowing the deep structures of your rituals of the church. Now, you don't forget that. That will identify you as a Roman Catholic. And the same argument for Muslims, any form of ritual that will define them as Muslims is part of the identity formation of the religious faith that can be imperiled or that can be put to test when globalization or unifying element is already in place. Okay, that is the issue there. Now, next is globalization and regionalization. Okay, diniscuss na natin ang globalization, the interconnectedness of nations. Now we talk about regionalization. Pag sinasabi nating region, we talk about Asia, we talk about Europe. Asia is not the whole globe. Asia is part of the whole globe, but it is not the entire globe. So regionalization talks about integration among different countries within the same region. So we have the Philippines as part of the ASEAN or ASEAN. So anong mga countries ng ASEAN? We have Thailand, we have Singapore, we have Myanmar, and all the other nations within the ASEAN region. We are regionally integrated. Okay, we create a sense of oneness and mutual interdependence. Okay, and there's going to be an understanding of the culture, what we call a free exchange of goods and services. People in the Philippines can go to Vietnam without the need for visa. Okay, this is part of the integration process, and we have one voice and one community, supposedly like that. And in terms of jobs, Filipino workers can freely go to other countries within the same region without having to deal with restrictions. And we have free trade agreements wherein our goods, our rice, for instance, will not be imposed tariff when we will export them to other members of the nation. Walang mga restrictions because we are regionally integrated. Okay, there's openness within the region. All right, and then in the European continent, there is the European Union or the EU. And the one characteristic of EU there is the euro currency. Euro is the currency of the European Union that unites different countries within the Union. So it defines their oneness as expressed in the currency. Okay? And they share the same views of free trade, okay, restrictions of any kinds of travel, visas within the same boundaries. Now, when a European, for example, will come to the Philippines, when a European country like Spain comes to the Philippines, Spain is not part of the ASEAN. Spain a Spaniard will have to need to acquire a visa in order to get into the country because Spain is not part of the ASEAN integration. In the same way as if a Filipino goes to Spain, being not a member of the European Union, we will have to submit a visa to the country, to Spain, okay? Now, there is a concept of locality that is discussed in the module. The sentiment of locality. Ibig sabihin yan, as a nation, we think about economic interconnectivity in the global level. Okay, we talk about mutual interdependence, understanding of nations. Okay, those are abstract notions, by the way. They are plans, they are visions. Okay, but how do you implement these things? We implement them locally. So sinasabi natin na locality, ibig sabihin it's a combination of the global and the local. So global is the thinking, local is the implementation. So we contextualize what has been thought in the global perspective by putting it in the local perspective. Okay, so in that way, we are actually making our visions work within our communities. Because sometimes we think too much outside of the box, we think about the entire globe, but we do not really implement them because we cannot really see the whole world as it is. We need to find the immediate surroundings where we can contextualize the solutions that we want to post for the goodness of mankind in that particular area. All right? In the political arena, globalization also talks about power relations. So power relations simply means that there are dominant countries that are in the playground of power structures. There are dominant countries that they create their domineering status because they have the resources and they have the capability to dominate, and they really want to assert their power. So meron tayong mga countries that have territorial tendencies, ownership of these territories, and not only that, but also in the political arena in terms of relationships with other states that are less dominant, okay, that are subservient to the policies of the dominant countries. So they end up, in some cases, they end up receptacles or mere what you call as objects that accept what is handed down to them. There are different levels of implications on that account. Okay, it creates a sense of imbalance, and it creates a sense of oppressive structure that only call for emancipation of those struggles, which we will talk about later on. All right, and then finally we have the global city. The global city, okay, you will realize that globalization has given rise to production activities strategically located in urban centers globally. So ang global city is nothing but just a network, a complete network of the goods, services, information, and knowledge. They create an interconnection, interconnectedness within the same city. Like for example, if we talk about Manila, Manila can be considered a global city because all these complex processes of information and technology and goods and services, jobs, education, things like that, they are one in the same center. Para silang tinatawag na tech hub or eco hub, economic hub, meaning a center for economic activities. We have so many global cities around the world. We have Tokyo, we have New York. They're just economic superpowers in simple language. Okay, what are the reasons why we have global cities? First, the proliferation of technology used in education, economy, among other functionalities, has connected nations at a great speed. So because of the increase of technology, people are actually forming networks of which are connections and create a wider spectrum of economic and other means of what you call this processes. Second, the regulation and privatization of companies has unbundled and loosened government interventions. So once again, bakit dumami ang global cities? Kasi ang ating pamahalaan no longer controlled these companies, no? Due to privatization of these companies, they were given the chance to make themselves better off or to compete with the rest of the companies within the society, so that out of which, according to the rules of capitalism, okay, they were able to indulge in free enterprise, okay, and those who were successful were part of the global city recipients. They benefited global city because they had the advantages of privatization. Okay, the rules were no longer restricted, and they were able to maximize their potentials. Okay. Finally, global cities drive the economy as their powerhouse, meaning to say it is the engine for macroeconomic activities. So ang imagine natin ang Manila as a global city, it is the center of all activities of the Philippines. Sadly it is true. Why sad? Because other provinces are also left behind. They become receptacles, okay, and sometimes mga hand-me-down effects of the global city, no? Because we pay too much attention on the imperialistic tendency of the global city, which is Manila in this case. So now we close our module with the negative effects of globalization. So first is the inability of nations to be integrated. This is an entire globe with so many countries. So there is always the threat, okay, and the pitfall of not uniting all these different countries because of so many reasons. We have cultural differentiations, disparities in standards of living, okay, economic well-being. Some countries are not able to integrate with the rest of the world, things like that. So yun pa lang, those countries that cannot join the globalization race will be left behind. And also, there are countries that are resisting globalization because they want to protect their cultural identity. Now remember, when you are into globalization, there is a notion of giving up a certain part of your culture because you have to go with the globalization. So that is a negative effect of globalization that we have to watch out. And then in the political front, okay, of course, those domineering institutions and people and institutions will always have the chance to exploit people's resources. Okay, it creates imbalance and disequilibrium in the economy. In the digital age, okay, globalization also creates this digital divide, meaning to say those people with the technology will be able to know how to operate the technology. We have the new cell phones, the laptops, and all the others. Okay, they are part of the integration process because they know how to handle these technologies. But the others are not joining the race because they don't know how to use the digital gadget. They are at the other end of the spectrum. They are the digital poor, meaning to say they are not able to create potentials out of the technology that is already there. And also, technology is not there for that matter. Okay, so to conclude our discussion of Module 1, globalization has both positive and negative effects that we have to think about. Okay, what are the benefits? Do they outweigh the costs to globalization, or do they bring more harm? All right, so globalization is already here. We are experiencing it. We just have to be cautious about the effects in our way of life. Okay, that's it for Module 1. Thank you.